Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter.
So Chris, what are we talking about on this week's show?
Right Peter, it's all about spring bulbs.
Okay.
In all their guises.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to be looking at, from daffodils to tulips to alliums to crocus.
Brilliant. So, I mean, everyone always thinks of spring, don't they? And when you see the snowdrops coming out into flower, don't they? We all know that spring is around the corner, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit about timing and how to plant them and some tips. Have you got for us this week, Chris?
Yeah, so everything we need to know, and hopefully our guest Ian will give us lots of enthusiastic talk about the varieties we should be growing as well.
Yes, because we got Ian Clark from Taylor's Bulbs, haven't we, this week?
We have, and Taylor's Bulbs obviously supply the garden centre, but they supply obviously lots of garden centres, so...
They're a massive bulb company, aren't they? And they're a British company, another family company, and I think based over in Lincolnshire, aren't they?
That's right, and not down and over towards Spalding, so those wonderful levels, obviously very compatible to our friends across the water in Holland, where, of course, they grow a lot of bulbs too.
Yes. What is the perfect bulb growing sort of soil, Chris? Is it?
It's going to be quite light, is it? It's going to be quite sandy soil, not heavy. Certainly you won't be able to grow them very well commercially on Buckingham clay, that's for sure.
No, too wet and heavy, yeah.
So fast draining is quite important, and obviously good moisture retention, but not certainly on the heavy side. And a soil which is going to warm up quite quickly as well in the spring.
Okay, that's a good point, yeah. And nutrient levels, I mean, I always think of sort of bulbs as a nutrient storage device, and
that's what they are,
presumably we have to feed them well to get them to give us some flowers. So is it good to put some compost in the same hole that you're planting your bulb in?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's a bit of we're in a dilemma, because when you actually buy a bulb, you're buying a storage organ, and actually I would say 99.9% of bulbs already have the flower embryonically in that bulb. And what we're trying to do is just nurture that flower out. So, yes, the soil conditions are important, i.e. you don't want it to be particularly waterlogged, but you want the soil conditions to be, conducive for that plant to grow well. So, yes, certainly that's the most important key issue, that no waterlogging and plenty of organic matter for those roots then to develop into, so the bulb then develops in future years to a better quality.
Brilliant. Good point.
And we're delighted to be joined today by Ian Clark, Business Manager, OA Taylors and Sons Bulbs, over in Holbeach, Lincolnshire. Welcome, Ian. And how do we find you today?
Yeah, very good, thank you. We're in the middle of our busiest time of the year, of course, with bulb harvesting and packing and grading and starting to send bulbs out to garden centres. But yeah, we're very well, thank you, yeah.
Perfect. And yes, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with the name of Taylor's Bulbs and the garden centres and shops they visit. Synonymous really with the bulb. Perhaps it would be good to start this podcast by looking at a little bit of the history of Taylor's Bulbs down in Spalding. Could you sort of take us through a bit of a timeline of the company?
Of course, yeah. So the company was established in 1919, so we've just recently celebrated our centenary. That was by Otto Augustus Taylor, which is where the OA Taylor comes from. Uh-huh. So he was gassed in the First World War and got given I think they call them crown colonies, piece of land to grow. Originally I think it was intended for vegetables, but he quickly worked out that he could make more money from growing flowers and selling them in London. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of how the firm started. And then over the years, they acquired more land, and we got into bulb growing specifically. So, I mean, in the 1950s, we used to grow tulips as well as narcissus and other bulbs as well. We're now in the fourth generation of the Taylors family. So Adam Taylor and Sam Taylor are now running the business. And predominantly we grow daffodils. So we grow over 500 different varieties of daffodils, but probably around 60 to 65 of those are what we call main stock, so large quantities. We're growing those here in Lincolnshire. We're also importing bulbs from around the world. As you can imagine, the majority come from Holland, but also other countries as well. And then we're packing them here at Holbeach and supplying our garden centre customers, mostly around the UK, but also Ireland, and we do a little bit of export as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm slightly off topic, but we've been selling your Christmas potatoes at the garden centre. I think we've just given to the last few packs actually, which is really good news. I mean, the diversity.
We've got some more if you need them.
Yeah, well, I might take your up on that. No, but certainly they've proved very, very popular. I think 3 or 4 varieties now are being offered to gardeners, and I think that's the thing. This conception of what is a bulb. And what is a growing tuber in the form of potatoes. But perhaps if you can maybe explain how those wonderful spring bulbs are grown, especially your daffodil and narcissi.
Yeah, so the daffodils here that we grow in Lincolnshire, we grow them in ridges like potatoes, and there's a couple of reasons for that really. We like to keep their feet out of the water, so when we get water, the bulbs aren't sat underwater for periods of time, but also a lot of the machinery that's used for harvesting and grading the bulbs and things is crossover with potatoes, which we grow a lot of as well. So in the growing cycle of the bulb, we plant them around, well, we're actually starting planting next week, first ones here, so middle to end of August, and then those bulbs stay in the ground for 2 years. So then after 2 years, we would harvest them in June. And from those, then we're looking to dry the bulbs and then grade the bulbs. So when we say grading, what we're doing is separating out the different size bulbs. So bulbs are measured in circumference. So the smallest bulbs, which would be typically a 7 to 10 centimetre bulb, they would be our planting stock for the following 2 years. And then the larger bulbs, the 12 to 14 and 14 to 16 centimetre bulbs, would be what we then pack and sell to garden centres. Once we've pulled the planting stock out, we then would sterilise the bulbs, which is not chemical, that's actually done with warm water. So they get a bath basically, which kills things like nematodes and soil pests, things like that. Before then they're dried and ready to plant back again.
Gosh, it sounds like a seamless process, but I'm sure there's lots of problems along the way potentially. But on that,
absolutely, yeah.
Yes. On the fact that you've got obviously so many different varieties of narcissi and daffodils and such like, are those then rotated? Do you actually rotate the crops as you would with your arrowwood crops?
Yeah. So we wouldn't plant narcissus daffodils back in the same soil for 7 years. So once they've come out, it's then 7 years before we would put that field down to daffodils again. So we've actually got about 1,800 acres here, but about 400 of that would be daffodils at any one time. So then the other crops we grow predominantly potatoes is the other main big crop we do, but also wheat and barley, sugar beet, brassicas as well, broccoli, things like that. So yeah, we're growing those in a cycle to fit in with the daffodils.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good way of utilising your space and your land and making sure your crops remain healthy in the scheme of things. On the area of actually producing the bulbs, when they end up coming into the garden centre, there are so many questions our customers ask, and I'm sure many of the listeners to our podcast will be asking. Are there any, especially when it comes to spring flowering bulbs, the plants and the bulbs we're going to be planting over the next probably three months or so, any real do's and don'ts as far as getting the best from your bulbs?
Bulbs are really easy to grow. I think that's a key message really. They're not difficult at all. Majority of bulbs, the depth is reasonably important, but it's not critical to the millimetre. And even if you plant them on their side or even some of them upside down, they're still going to grow. Our daffodils, when they're planted, we're not planting each one precisely by hand. They're going in from a piece of machinery, and it's not fussy to which way up they are. So they'll still grow. And the bulbs here, we literally for 2 years we don't really do much at all to them. They're not they don't get watered because of the salt level in the water table here. We can't irrigate because we're quite close to the sea. And yeah, they're left, they don't get fed either. They're left to their own devices, really. But in terms of feeding, if you want to feed your bulbs, the best time is after they've flowered, as the foliage is dying back, and a tomato food is best for that, because that's going to be, got the nutrients in for fruit and flower rather than nitrogen for the leaves. You don't want a lot of nitrogen. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, we're certainly on Dig It. We like to promote the fact that tomato feed is probably the go-to fertiliser for getting really good
Definitely,
results. Yeah. I mean, we did have a question actually from Mrs. Hardy about what happens if you accidentally plant your bulb upside down. You've nicely answered that, but I suppose when it comes to planting, containers and where you're being a little bit more specific, does there come a point where you do have to perhaps be a little bit more careful with the depth?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, the layered planting, lasagne planting in pots is a classic type of planting for bulbs. So when we're talking about that, if you think about a lasagna where you've got your different layers, we're basically doing that with bulbs. So you typically start with, say, tulips as your base layer, and then narcissus a little bit shallower, and then something like crocus on the top, which can, they can be real shallow. In fact, some bulbs you would plant almost on the surface with the tips of the bulbs coming through the soil. So yeah, that would be but generally certainly our packets all have the detailed planting instructions on them, and that would include the planting depth and the width as well. The width is quite important apart from the bulbs, because if you plant them too close, they can get overcrowded quite quickly. So yeah, that's important.
I have to say, Ian, you do produce, I think you're still producing sort of mixed packs of spring bulbs where you give a range of 3 or 4 different varieties. I've often used those in lasagne plantings at home, and the results have been really good. It is absolutely foolproof planting, but the thing is, you plant those sort of containers up your pot, and you forget what you've put in, because of course you tend to mislay your information, and of course it's all a bit of a surprise. So I think lasagne planting, for all it can be a little bit tedious, I think this is the way to go if you've got pots in your garden, especially if you've got a smaller garden. Certainly,
But if you choose the varieties right as well, you could have a good couple of 2 or 3 months of flowers potentially, because you can start with, well, some of our own daffodils would flower in certainly January, and then you could have your crocus in February and March, and then your tulips in April and May. So you can if you plan it by the flowering times, you can have a long time. Another little tip as well, always sort of plant over the top of the bulbs with winter bedding, cyclamen, the winter pansies, something like that, so that you've got some colour there on the pot, before the spring. That's always a good thing to do.
Indeed, yeah. We tend to, at the garden centre here, to suggest winter flowering pansies and violas are the go-to. They cover the soil, and then of course you get that nice bit of extra colour in the spring when the bulbs are coming to their end or just about to start into flower. Although we've sort of touched on it, good old the RHS many years ago did quite a lot of research on how long you were really to leave your daffodils, and they came up with the magical 6-week rule, which basically meant that when the flowers started to fade, you marked on your calendar, on your diary, on your phone, 6 weeks from that point when you could cut the plants back. Have you any other sort of general rules when it comes to cutting back spring bulbs?
I think that's a good rule of thumb to use. Some people talk about tying off the leaves, but I wouldn't recommend that really. I think if you're thinking about planting certainly daffodils in drifts in grass for naturalising, try and pick the earlier flowering varieties, because if you pick the varieties that are flowering in April and May, and then you've got to then wait another 6 weeks, it's going to be a long time before you can cut your grass. So
of course.
Yeah, so if you pick the earlier flowering ones in grass, that's usually a good thing. But yeah, I mean, basically, if you do cut the leaves off too early, that's a common cause of blindness, where the bulb puts a stem up but with no flower, and that's because the the nutrients from the leaves haven't gone back into the bulbs to bulk the bulb up to produce its food for the next year. So yeah.
Right, fascinating. Right, I didn't realise that. So most daffodils are grown in the southwest, down in Cornwall, in Devon. Yet Wales claims it to be its national flower. So my question is to you: is it a UK native, and are there any other unhybridised or natural versions left or sold available to the home gardener at all?
Yeah, so the main one, Obvalaris, which is the 10B daffodil, that's often one that's talked about. Lobularis is the other one. That's probably what you would term as the native one. Obvalaris is still, we still sell. Lobularis we stopped selling probably a couple of years ago. It's not very widely available because the stocks are very weak and don't grow that well, to be honest. There is another one we sell which isn't a native one, but it's called WP Milner, and that's quite similar looking to Lobularis. So although it's not actually the true one, that's a good alternative one as well.
Oh, that sounds good. Those are the ones to go for then. Obviously all these varieties you bring out and obviously are introduced. Is there a particular sort of selection process for the new varieties which head towards being sold in garden centres?
Certainly, here at Taylor's we tend to do a few different things, but we usually send 2 or 3 of us go over to obviously Holland often to look at tulips and things in the spring, and we would be taking photos and making notes of varieties we use. There are some sort of trade trial grounds we visit, as well as the Keukenhof, of course, which is always a good visit. Recommend that to anyone if they're over in Holland in the spring. And then we also we've dealt with a lot of the same growers for generations really, and they will send us sample bulbs which we grow on trial grounds here, so we can look at them and assess them as well. And then we tend to go and visit all of our growers in November as well. So we would then talk to them about what they've got coming available, new varieties. And then we can pencil those in for the year after, or sometimes even 2 or 3 years down the line. So that tends to be how we work with new varieties.
That sounds very exciting, and that's great for the gardener then.
With the daffodils, with the daffodils, we tend to we've always got a bank of what we call numbered varieties. So where we haven't registered them, we haven't named them, they're just there, and then we assess those and keep looking at them, and the ones we like we grow more of, and some of them get cast aside. They might look exactly the same as another one we've already got, and the same flowering time, same height, so we don't need it. But and then often, once we get enough of enough stock of a variety, we would then look to come up with a name and register it with the RHS, and then start marketing it. So yeah.
Good process. And on that side of things, sort of most popular bulbs actually sold then in the UK. What's your top selling spring bulb, and maybe something for the summer as well? Although we're talking spring bulb, but obviously we know from after Christmas we get our plethora of obviously summer flowering bulbs from you. So could you perhaps just give us the couple which
spring bulbs? Yeah, Narcissus Tete-a-Tete, of course, is the one that everybody knows, and it's still the one that by volume we handle more than millions and millions of those a year. So that's by far the most popular one. But a lot of the staple varieties, Allium Purple Sensation, again, it's these bulbs they're reliable. They're what we call doers. They always perform. You doesn't matter what the conditions, they always do well. They're good growing varieties. Tulip Red Riding Hood, Tulip Angelique, a double pink. That's always a popular one. Snowdrops, of course, always popular.
Have you seen any sort of trends over the years? I mean, do bulbs go through phases of being sort of in? Do you find?
Sure, yeah, definitely. Alliums they've been used more and more at Chelsea, and they seem to have just become really, really popular at the moment. With sort of allotment boom cutting flowers are popular. So tulips for cutting are quite popular. A lot of people doing cutting gardens. I would say in summer bulbs and dahlias, well, they've come from
Yes.
sort of zero to hero, really. They're just so popular now. It's crazy. By far the most popular summer flowering bulb. But lilies are probably on the comeback, I would say, at the moment. Even gladioli as well. They sort of went quite out of fashion, but becoming a bit more popular. And there's some shorter flowering gladioli now, which are getting quite popular. They're good for smaller gardens or even pots, that you could use them in pots. So, yeah.
Yes, which I have done that actually. Some of those very, I think is it the butterfly varieties which keep reasonably compact as well. Some of those are really good for
there's
those.
the Narnus ones, which are the hardy ones. They're the little small dainty ones. But then we've got some newer, they're large flowering gladioli, but they're just shorter flowering. So there's a few different varieties of those coming on board now, and they're quite good. So, yeah. That's
really good, yeah. So we were talking about, obviously, spring flowering bulbs. Of course, crocus are probably up there as the most, well, certainly one of the first flowering, probably after the snowdrops. Now, I believe that saffron is derived from crocus, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the use of saffron from the crocus and its possible usage as far as commerce.
Yeah, so it's Crocus sativus, which is the variety that you can harvest saffron from, and it's the stamens, the orange stamens of the flower, that you can harvest the saffron. Crocus sativus is an autumn flowering crocus, so you would plant it now, really, in the next few weeks, and they would flower in September and October. Pretty little thing in its own right, like a nice lilac flower with these bright orange stamens, which make it quite striking, really. I believe there are some commercial growers of saffron in the UK, in the south, I think. It's certainly not something we've really got involved with, but we do supply quite a lot of Crocus sativus, and it's definitely our most popular autumn flowering crocus. So, yeah.
And I think, am I right in thinking it produces its flower and then the leaves follow? Is it one of those sort of a little bit like colchicums, or am I going down the wrong garden path there?
Yes, I think you might be right. So a lot of the colchicums are known as naked ladies because they put the flower up before the leaf. You sometimes even see them flowering in the packets in garden centres in late September, and that's actually not a problem at all. If you can still plant them, even if they're in flower when you take the bulb out of the packet, it's not a problem.
No.
They'll still flower the following year, and it's no trouble at all. So,
no, I'm a great fan of colchicums. I think they're very undervalued, and we should plant more of them. So, all good. Now, tulips obviously remain a firm favourite, and of course they were first introduced to England in the 1630s as tulipmania swept the gardens of the wealthy Europeans. However, many tulip varieties offered these days now come as only flowering tulips from the cut flower sector. Do you think gardeners should be aware if tulips are once bloomers, and perhaps should that be popped on the packaging?
Well, I mean, I've found the tulips I've planted, single late varieties, Triumph tulips, they do. I mean, I've got some in pots, single early varieties called Royal Celebration, and it does come back every year, to be honest, although probably not as well, not as well year after year as the first year. But there are some tulips, Darwin hybrid varieties. So, for instance, there's a series called Impression tulips. So you've got Red Impression is a classic red tulip. That's what we call a Darwin hybrid. And the Darwin hybrids do come back better than most year after year. You've also got species tulips, like Humilis varieties, Baker Lilac Wonder, Honky Tonk, Praestons, Tinker, those type of little ones. They will naturalise and come back very well year after year. So yeah, there are options there if you want more perennial flowering tulips.
Yeah, I think the thing a lot of people is that they buy their tulips, relatively inexpensive. They get a wonderful show, and sometimes it's the faff of having to lift them and obviously grow them on or dry them to get them to flower for a second year. I think that puts a lot of people off, doesn't it?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, of course, we would say buy new ones every year, of course, but that's but yeah, that's understandable. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't go to the trouble of lifting them myself. I haven't got anywhere to dry or store them
No, indeed.
myself, and I'm sure many people are the same. But yeah, like I say, if you choose the right ones, they will come back well year after year.
Yeah, I think in my garden I've tried to plant in the open borders lots of the Darwin types, and they all seem to perform really well, sort of year on year, which is good. What any other particular bulbs popular for thinking if you're thinking about doing some planting over the next sort of 6-8 weeks? What do you put on your shopping list when you come to the garden centre?
Certainly, some of what we call the miscellaneous bulbs, the lesser known things, can be really interesting and useful. For instance, something like Nectaroscordum siculum, which is the honey lily, that's a really nice one. It's actually a type of allium, but it looks nothing like an allium. But that will be covered in bees, and that would be something you'd plant in the autumn. That's a lovely one. Camasias, so used a lot for meadow planting, tolerant of wetter conditions as well, and fantastic, stunning blue spikes, flower spikes. They're really nice. What else would we say? Fritillaria, the fritillaries. I mean, the crown imperials. You talk about things coming back every year. They will come back really strong every year. Crown imperials.
Oh, wow.
They're not the cheapest bulbs to buy. You can be paying £4 or £5 for one bulb, but they really do perform. Stunning, huge, exotic flowers, and they come back every year.
Yeah, it's one of those we do get asked for a lot, and sometimes we do get them in containers, and obviously they're really expensive as a potted bulb, and it's one you tend to quite easily miss if you're not careful at this time of the year. Certainly, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah, when you're planting those, you always plant. We talked earlier about the right way up to plant bulbs. Now with the crown imperials, Fritillaria imperialis, you should always plant those on their side because they actually have like a hollow bit in the bulb where the flower would have been, and if you plant them sort of normal way up, that can fill with water and rot the bulbs. So they're always best planted on the side.
Oh right, that's a really good tip. Galanthamine is a chemical used in the control in Alzheimer's drug to slow the progression of the disease, and it's available in daffodils. I didn't know this. It's a really interesting fact. Has Taylor's sort of been involved in any sort of areas of development of this within the drug companies?
Yes, so there different daffodil varieties have different levels of galanthamine. I'm by no means an expert on this. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a chemist. But yeah, different varieties have different levels. We have found that one of the varieties we grow has got very high levels of galanthamine in, and we have had drug companies contact us and buy bulbs off us, by the ton for that. I believe they crush the bulbs down and then extract it through water, I believe, to get the galanthamine out. But pharmaceutical companies, I think we used to supply some in the UK and also in Europe as well.
Right, excellent. That's really good to hear, and long may it continue because it's obviously going to be an important part of the Alzheimer's drugs course over the next few years, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Moving indoors now, prepared bulbs, as we like to call them, are obviously the way forward when you want to grow bulbs a little bit earlier for Christmas. I suppose, first of all, we need to explain what the term prepared means to our listeners.
Yes, typically hyacinth, you would see two types of hyacinth in the garden centre. So you would have prepared bulbs, which are for indoor growing, and you would have just normal bedding or garden hyacinth. They're exactly the same bulb. They come from the same production, the same field, same growing, everything's the same. Sometimes I know when I used to work in garden centres, people used to think the prepared meant they'd been treated with chemicals, but it's not at all. It's simply a heat preparation. So they have a heat preparation, which then means that the flower in the bulb forms earlier, so that when you then grow it at home, you put it in the dark and the cold, and it produces its roots, it will flower earlier than just a standard garden bulb. But prepared hyacinths, you can plant them in the garden just the same. They're still hardy as well. So if you grew hyacinths in a bowl in the house, you could then plant them outside after they'd flowered, and they'd flower the next spring in the garden, no problem. So yeah.
Yeah, okay.
There's different bulbs you can grow indoors, of course. So hyacinths is a classic because they're fragrant, very showy, big flowers. But paper whites is probably the next most popular. Amaryllis, of course, but also tulips, muscari, other narcissus as well. You can all the trade term is forcing bulbs, but to get them to grow and flower early indoors. Typically, to grow bulbs like that indoors, what you're doing is actually you're changing the bulb seasons, so you're simulating winter early to try and get them to flower earlier than they naturally would in the spring. That's basically what forcing means. So, for instance, muscari or narcissus, you could grow in a pot. You'd plant them normally, water them, and then you'd give them 10 to 12 weeks below 10 degrees, frost-free, but below 10 degrees, typically in the dark. And then after that's for them to form their roots, because if you don't do that right, before the roots are formed, the flower will not flower very well. It will be deformed or weak. So once they form their roots after 10 or 12 weeks, bring them into the warm and the light, and then they're going to flower nice and early, typically December or January. If you get it right, you could have them in flower for.
Yeah, I think it is all about the timing, and certainly bringing them into, cooler conditions first sometimes can hold them back a little bit, isn't it? Especially running up to Christmas, when we tend to put our, have the house a lot warmer. So if you're trying to trick your bulbs, sometimes just manipulating the temperatures a little bit can make all the difference for flowering.
Yeah,
certainly. Yeah. Thinking about, obviously we're recording this and we're talking for the month of September now, and our gardens are ablaze with summer bulb colour. I'm thinking lilies, gladioli, and of course dahlias. Any sort of tips on prolonging those displays which you're enjoying now, so we can get the best from them?
I think with gladioli, it's interesting more, not so much now, but when you plant gladioli, if you plant them in waves, so you could have an early planting, a mid planting, a late planting, you could actually prolong the flowering period. So that's an interesting thing with gladioli. Dahlias, of course, will flower right up until the first frosts. If they're in pots, keep them watered. And then once they've finished flowering, quite a lot of the summer flowering bulbs aren't fully hardy, so they do need a bit of protection in the winter. So obviously people lift dahlias as well, but certainly if you're not going to lift your bulbs, a mulch in the autumn is a very good idea. If they're in pots, just bring them, close to a house wall, or if you've got a shed or a glass house, just bring them in out the worst of the winter, and then they should come back the next year fine. That's probably the best thing to do.
Yeah, but certainly with the displays we've been having this year, especially with the weather being so very mixed, with our bulbs have obviously sort of enjoyed it and has been delayed. Thinking about if there's going to be anything new on the bulb horizon for our UK growers and gardeners this autumn, any new varieties or plants we need to be thinking about for 2022?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we always try and bring out, I don't know, a good 20 or 30 new varieties every year if we can. We've got in daffodils some of our own varieties that we grow here in Holbeach in Lincolnshire. We've got High Society, which is a white with a sort of peachy cup. That's a nice one. And also in Narcissus, we've got Dream Castle. That's a new one. That's a pure white, one of from our own production. In the smaller Narcissus, we've got a nice new one called Angel's Whisper, which is a real dainty lemon-coloured one. That's a nice one. Thinking about tulips, new tulips. So we've got a lot of new tulips. Actually, a lovely pink parrot tulip called Cabana. So the parrot tulips, with the frilly edges. That's a
lovely,
really nice one. Also, a new Mascari called Grape Ice. That's a purple flower with a white tip. So that's quite unique for Mascari. They're normally blue or sometimes white, but this is a purple one. So that's a really interesting one. Camassia Sacagawea. That's a new Camassia, relatively new, but the really interesting thing, it's a white flower, but the really interesting thing about it is it's got beautiful variegated foliage. So when it's coming up, it looks like a really nice decorative grass when it's coming up. And then you get the white flowers as well. So that's a new one. Probably lastly, because I could go on for too long about this, but Allium ostara, that's a real star one. So most alliums, as they flower, the foliage dies back. So they're better for borders, coming up through herbaceous plants and things like that. But Allium ostara, the foliage stays really nice as it flowers. So, and it's quite short flowering alliums. It's only about 40 centimetres flowering height. So it's perfect for growing in pots or, in gravel or something like that. So it's a really nice one, that.
That sounds really good, actually, because I grow quite a few of my alliums in containers, so that'll be on the shopping list, I'm sure. That sounds good. Yeah, most bulbs are grown for their flower, but there are obviously some which are grown for flower and scent. Ian, what would be your favourite, and which you'd probably recommend to our podcast listeners?
Certainly, hyacinth, I think, are fantastic. We talked about hyacinths for indoors, but if you put a pot of hyacinths near your back door, the scent is just fantastic. And personally, I like the scent. It's a strong scent, but it's a nice scent, and you can get a lot of different colour hyacinth, from whites and blues to purples and delicate pinks as well. So some really nice ones there. And actually tulips as well. There's some really nice scented tulips. Things like we mentioned Angelique earlier, a double, that's got a lovely scent, and quite a few of the peony double tulips can be scented. So nice, delicate scent on those. There's some nice ones.
Yeah, on Dig It, we like to identify the plants which are particularly bee friendly. So in the world of bulbs, which any ones you would sort of recommend growing for our bees? You mentioned the allium a little bit earlier.
Yeah, for sure. All of the alliums are definitely bee friendly. We actually put the RHS Perfect for Pollinator logo on all of our packs that are relevant. So look out for that. Crocus, most of the crocus are bee friendly and a good source for early spring for the bees. The ones that we have, Nectroscordum, we mentioned the honey lily. Mascari as well. Quite a few of the Mascari are good for bees. Again, quite early for the bees, they're good. But, and in the summer flowering bulbs as well, the single flowering dahlias are very good. We've got a trial ground full of dahlias at the moment, and the amount of bees is just ridiculous. Really good to go and see.
Oh, that's good to hear. Okay, we often ask our guests what particular plant would they grow on their imaginary castaway island, desert island, of course. So, Ian, what would be your favourite castaway bulb if you had to choose one, and why?
It's got to be a daffodil, hasn't it? Working for a daffodil grower, it's got to be a daffodil.
Yep.
I'm not sure how they'd cope with the sand, though, but they'd need to plenty of water. But yeah, they're going to come back every year then as well. Nice flowers of daffodil. That would be my favourite, I think.
That's perfect. That's lovely. Okay, so at this point, we normally ask our guests for a joke, gardening related. Ian, do you have a particular joke for us?
I've had to put a lot of thought into this one, Chris. But what did the big flower say to the little flower?
I don't know. What did the big flower say to the little flower?
What's up, bud?
Great. That's how we like to end our podcast, on a high. Thank you, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, the world of growing bulbs. I mean, I love growing bulbs. I get really excited at this time of year when I start to see the display starting to fill up and those wonderful colour pictures appear. I mean, it is a bit of a dream factory, isn't it? I think after the seed companies, bulb producers do the best jobs to entice us with those wonderful visuals. So it's been a pleasure, and I'm sure a lot of people will be going out there and buying not just one or two or maybe more than that packs of bulbs in all shapes, colours and sizes to give their spring that extra wow this year. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us on Dig It.
No problem. Pleasure.
Thank you.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
Oh, good old William Wordsworth.
Indeed. It's a lovely poem that really captures your imagination about how daffodils blowing in the wind.
Yes.
They do look lovely, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, obviously William Wordsworth was raised up in the Lake District, so it also paints a very attractive picture of Ullswater and Grasmere, where supposedly that poem was partly originated from.
Okay, because most of our daffodils in this country are grown in Cornwall and sort of the Devon, aren't
Yes,
they?
yeah, I think, going down to, Cornish daffodils are obviously what we tend to see in the supermarkets in the early part of the spring.
Okay, I suppose because it's a little bit warmer down there, they come on a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think they start their production as it's around about Christmas, isn't it, or just before? Because often you get, again, supermarkets tend to capitalise on the fact that daffodils and Christmas sort of go together. Forget the poinsettia, but people just like that little bit of fresh. Scent
nice,
and colour.
Bright yellow colour, isn't it? Because normally you don't think of daffodils of having a great scent, but some of the varieties do actually have a good scent, don't they?
Indeed, yes. And yes, I think we've got to trace it back to, I think, the Scilly Isles, where a lot of the original production sort of started. And I think when we were doing a little bit of research, I think 1875 sort of cropped up as a notable date.
Yeah, because I think that was when they started sort of shipping them up to London for the, I guess, the barrow markets and the sort of flower markets. People in those days, a nice bunch of yellow flowers would be probably quite nice amongst all the smog and other things that the poor Londoners had to endure back then.
And I suppose, Covent Garden, as it was then, was supported by a really good network of railways then, and obviously roads. So that was also kicking in. So those flowers could be, cut quite quickly, and then obviously shipped and then obviously sold very, very quickly within probably a 2 or 3 day span. Which obviously is probably what happens these days. It's not really
not much different, is it?
No.
I think, like you say, though, speed is of the essence with daffodils, because they don't last for that long once they've opened as flowers, do they? Maybe a couple of weeks or so. But
maximum, depending obviously on the temperature you keep them, really, isn't it? And
because something we learnt, wasn't it, that once they're cut, they're then refrigerated quite often these days to keep them from doing anything and keep them at sort of 3 degrees or so, and that just slows everything down.
And I noticed, most of the supermarkets, when you come to buy your daffodils, they're never actually sitting in water. They're usually in buckets, but they withhold the water because, of course, that hastens the whole production of, moisture gets into the flower, and of course that opens the flower. So they're chilled and kept dry.
So that's the trick, is it? Don't put them in the water until you're ready. You want them to come out into flower.
Yes, indeed. So plenty to chat about on the whole aspect of growing daffodils. Interestingly, we also discovered that was it the Tamar Double White was the variety which is still popular today, as varieties go.
Yeah, and as a commercial variety, and like you say, the Tamar Valley is obviously the centre of that. And
yeah, there's over in Cornwall, the famous Golden Mile, which is just over from St Marcel's Mount.
St Michael's Mount.
St Michael's Mount.
Yep.
I'm getting my countries mixed up. But that's very famous. That stretch of land. Obviously, the soil must be just perfect for growing them, and obviously now well known and world famous for the production of early narcissi.
Yeah, because it would be interesting to see with Brexit and all the import and export situations that have been sort of being brought up at the moment. I know, unfortunately, as a garden centre, we're probably not going to be able to export to Northern Ireland next year just because of all the red tape involved. And just, you think, I wonder how many other industries, people like the bulb growers, what that's going to do to their market.
I suspect it's going to have some major repercussions, isn't it? So the production will have to be really geared around the UK market, which, it's an ever-growing market. So hopefully there'll be enough demand to keep them busy.
Keep them all busy, yes, definitely. And then hopefully in the next few years we get the exporting sorted out again, so it doesn't have such a huge impact on all the businesses that rely on it.
Indeed. It's interesting, wasn't it, Peter, that we were talking about how popular the narcissi is. Obviously, 26 different cultivars, varieties from over 56 species, but Carlton is a variety which is synonymous to a particular Cornish breeder.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, it just shows you how how Cornwall has been a major player in the development of narcissi for commerce. So, and as gardeners, of course, can benefit from Carlton, such a good variety, and ones obviously we sell, and one you often find up and down the garden centre and DIY and supermarket aisles, as we speak.
So I think you're very right there, Chris. And obviously, the two sides of the industry in a way, where all of the bulbs that are grown for flower cutting, or cut flowers, should I call them, are coming from the southwest, and yet the actual commercial growing of them is coming from Lincolnshire and sort of a bit further north in slightly colder areas. But I mean, that's always the way with farming, isn't it? At the end of the day, you get sort of growers down on the south of the country, and then you also have growers up in Scotland and places that are a little bit later in, so that when the flowers come out in, say, Scotland, it's a month or so later than it would be down in Cornwall. So it prolongs the production of the species, so it opens the market up a bit more.
And it gives us consumers a longer and more improved enjoyment of a particular plant variety, isn't it, as well? To extend
exactly that. Because if you're ever travelling in Holland in spring, obviously there's the Keukenhof gardens.
Yes, I did visit them, Peter, but I was very, very young, so I have got photographs, black and white pictures, which don't really show.
Don't show the colour of it that well, actually.
But I was knee high to a grasshopper, so I can't really remember it. But I do know it was quite close to Amsterdam, in a place called Lis.
Yep.
And it's a big old place. It covers 32 hectares, and it has incredibly 7 million bulbs in bloom. Wow. Over that period of time. And I say the period of time, next year, that's 2022, it'll be open from the 24th of March through to the 15th of May inclusive. So
that's brilliant. So I can go for my birthday.
You could indeed.
That'd be lovely,
what a nice present that would be.
I can remember sort of seeing calendars and industry photographs of the bulb growing in Holland, and when you see all the tulips in flower, and you get a sort of 5-acre field just full of red tulips and then yellow ones next to it, and it's just
those aerial
amazing
shots, especially now with drones as well, they really do show up. But when you walk around Keukenhof, what I do say remember, but what I've seen a lot of photographically, is where they actually create large drifts of colour. So you've got individual varieties, so you might have just a particular colour, pink, I don't know, hyacinths, and then you might see this wonderful river of blue muscaria, the great hyacinth, put in there. So things, little tricks like that, you could actually probably create in your own garden if you had the size of garden, which would be quite good. In fact, I'm just thinking about it, Evenley Wood Gardens, just literally down the road from the garden centre, they have a rather nice bulb display in the spring, and they have their own little ravine of blue bulb interest. Just thinking about it. So yes, I mean, I'm sure in a lot of your local National Trust properties, you'll find particular niche displays of bulbs, which are obviously quite unique to that particular establishment. And of course, snowdrops are obviously famous. Snowdrop walks are particularly famous too. So
yeah, because I suppose it is a bit like carpet bedding, where if you've got enough space, you can do some phenomenal displays where you take big blocks of colour and sort of yellow tulips or red tulips or something like that. Then I guess the timing is also trying to get all the different varieties that you're going to plant to flower at a similar time will give you the biggest impact, although with the idea of using bulbs to sort of give you elongated flowering displays, you could start them with maybe sort of snowdrops and then move into daffodils and then move into sort of more summer-based bulbs, couldn't you?
Yeah, I think with Keukenhof, what's quite good as well, thinking about the visuals, they've got a lot of water features there, so they've got lots of sort of ravines, little rivers and streams, and of course it's not a flat piece of land, they've actually landscaped it and shaped it, so you've got these hillocks and bumps and mounds, which of course you can do wonderful displays. Of course then there's obviously a backdrop of wonderful trees, established trees, but they also bring in some nice sort of temporary plantings as well. So it is very artificial. I use the word artificial in a nice way, because what you're trying to do is give people ideas and inspiration and colour, which they can sort of replicate in their own gardens. And like whatever space you have with a bulb, you can do that.
Yeah, because I always think tulips look lovely sort of around the edge of a border. I don't know why. Just the fact sort of the height of them, and they're such beautiful flowers. They're sort of upright and colourful, and they're one of my favourites. I'm certainly going to have a go at trying to plant some of the Red Riding Hood this year, I think, around the edge of the garden.
Such a good variety, yes.
Well, I like things that come back each year without, I can just dig them into the ground once and off they go.
Indeed. Yeah, I know. I was that question I did pose to him was sort of a little bit double-barreled, because I'm aware that some varieties do better than others. And I think it is quite important when you're looking at on the bulb, on the displays, that it be sometimes quite useful to have that extra information to hand as a customer. I think that's quite important that we make those things. But certainly going for the old varieties like the Darwins, you're onto a really good result for future year displays.
Because one thing we mentioned was this term blind bulbs that are obviously ones that come up that just produce leaves and no flower. So one thing with those, Chris, if you say had a blind daffodil, can you feed it whilst it's in foliage and get it to then flower the following year? Or once they've gone blind, is that it? Are they then useless?
I think if it's just the odd one or two which are doing that, what I would do is just lift the bulb, replant it a little bit deeper than it was originally planted, so give it a bit more depth, and obviously improve the soil a little bit around there. And there are proprietary feeds now you can get. There's a mycorrhizal one, I think, called Bulb Boost, which helps to encourage a lot more root systems to form. But sometimes, and I know from experience, that bulbs, especially daffodils, can sort of move up through the soil and get closer to the soil, close to the surface. And of course, because that's happening, then they're not getting the water, they're not getting the nutrients. So sometimes just relifting your bulbs and lifting your bulbs and replanting them gives the plants that new start that they might require. But also, it's sometimes good to reintroduce some new stock as well.
Okay, because what's the sort of lifespan of a bulb, a daffodil?
I would have. I see most daffodils do reproduce. They do produce little offsets.
Because they sort of split, don't they? From memory, you start with one bulb, and the next sort of 2-3 years later, you dig it up, and it's suddenly turned into 4 or 5 little offshoots.
So they basically vegetatively propagate themselves in situ. So give them the right conditions. So I think that's quite important that we do feed directly after flowering, and that sort of 6-week rule, getting some feed, some granular feed, a high potassium feed, sulphate of potash, something like that, around the bulb as the leaves are starting to die back. Then all the goodness of those bulbs. And I know you mentioned about knotting. I mean, I must admit, to see daffodil bulbs, twisted into interesting shapes when you walk past people's gardens does slightly incense me a little bit. I want to go in there and reopen them up, untie them. Yes, because it is restricting the sap flow, because it's only 6 weeks of the plant basically building itself up to give you a really good display the following year. It's not an awful lot to ask, but I think a lot of people use daffodils in quite straight sort of displays. They don't mix the bulbs with other plants, so that foliage is very obvious. And I think if you can be careful with your planting, but use lots of herbaceous plants, lots of ground cover plants where the leaves can then sort of disappear.
Take over, yeah.
I think that sort of helps, doesn't it? Visually, anyway, and it doesn't look such a problem to our focal site. Yeah,
because I think thinking about that a bit more, you've got lots of places that use, say, daffodils and things like that, and maybe a grass bank or something like that. They do look a bit untidy after they've finished flowering, and I can understand people wanting to mow them down.
But naturalising bulbs is really quite good. I mean, you can naturalise not only with daffodils, but I mean, I've seen crocus. I have got a neighbour quite close to where I live actually naturalise snowdrops into his front lawn, and every year, usually about the third week in February, his lawn is white with snowdrops. It looks amazing, and you know, it's obviously something he likes to do. Then the lawn doesn't get cut until well into March, but every year in, year out, you get that sort of repeat display. If you've got plenty of space with larger amounts of land, if you've got a bit of a meadow, you know, you want to create a nice meadow effect, then Camasias are a bulb we sell, and they look really stately. And I remember seeing many years ago when we had a chance to go to Highgrove Gardens, which we've mentioned on the other podcasts. They look amazing. Camasias getting to sort of knee-high, planted en masse, not cheap, going to be quite expensive. However, wow, the effect is something to savour.
Excellent, isn't it? Well, maybe we'll start saving up and see if we can put a display together then.
Yeah.
So in the news this week, Chris, we've got Bulb of the Year awards.
Yes, so 2 bulbs for our podcast listeners to look out for when they're visiting garden centres. First of all is the Narcissi of the Year, which is the variety Fortune.
Okay. And what sort of colour is that?
So it's a yellow. It's a slight bicolour. So it's certainly got a nice strong yellow with a sort of paler centre to it. Really nice. It's been around for a long time. It's a good tried and tested variety.
Good solid variety.
Yep. And more excitingly, we've got Bulb of the Year for 2022.
Okay. What's that?
And that this year is going to be Anemone Blanda Blue. Okay. So anemone blanders. Now we're talking about how bulbs are so very different to look at. Have you come across any anemones in your planting? Yeah, they're really different, aren't they? But the bulbs are really weird. They're very odd, and they're quite small. And I grew them for the first time a couple of years ago, and I followed the instructions quite carefully. I actually soaked them for probably 20, 30 minutes before I planted them, just to plump them up because they sort of dry out. And then I planted them actually in containers. I used them in some window boxes, and they were magnificent. They did look really good. So look out for Anemone Blanda Blue as the bulb of the year for 2022.
And what sort of length of flowering are they going to give us?
Yeah, Fortune, the Narcissi, that's going to give you probably probably 3 or 4 weeks of colour. Bear in mind they're in flower when the temperatures are quite cool.
Yep.
So that should prolong, they're quite a short Narcissi. They're probably up to knee height, so they're not particularly large. And then, of course, anemones, I think they call them the windflower, don't they? So they're quite low growing. They're almost like a ground cover plant when you see anemones. So they should flower for at least 3 to 4 weeks too, if you're lucky.
Excellent. Okay. We're talking earlier about lasagne planting, Chris, weren't we?
Yes. So.
What can you tell us? You're doing. You're going to teach us or run a class, aren't you, soon?
Indeed, yeah. We're doing at the garden centre a part of our masterclass. It's kicking off the new season of masterclasses, and we're getting creative with bulbs.
Brilliant.
And in that, we're going to be doing some lasagne planting using spring bulbs.
Okay.
And I usually go to quite a reasonable layerage, shall we say.
Okay, so how many can we sort of get in a tub?
Yeah, I mean, generally 3 layers is good.
Okay.
5 layers is adventurous.
Yeah.
Many years ago, when I went on holiday, I was watching some TV. It was actually in the States, and there was a chap there doing a lasagne planting, and it was over 20 layers.
Gosh.
And I had to do a double take. I thought it was very horticultural. The program was very serious, but obviously in that part of the States they had some very cold winters.
Right.
So they had to use the insulating properties of the soil to grow a lot of the bulbs. Okay. So it actually worked well. What he did say was that the flower display was Obviously, the bulbs, once the temperature hit a certain level, all the bulbs wanted to go out and flower and play.
Yep.
So you probably didn't get the longevity which you would get from perhaps a more cool European climate.
Okay, because I love the idea of having winter violas on the top and just sort of pootling around over Christmas to give you a little bit of sort of cover and protection of the bulbs. And then as spring comes up, you've got this great length of flowering coming out of just a couple of pots that you've done. It's a really good idea. And
Peter, how many times I try to remember what I've put in, I always forget, and that's the surprise element.
Yeah.
And I think, so generally, you could go, the safest options usually is go for the crocus on the top layer,
yep,
and then the narcissi, and then the tulips.
Okay.
Because obviously the tulips are the last to flower, so they have to take their time pushing through between all the soils. And it's also a misnomer about the fact that, you should, like you pointed out quite rightly, it doesn't really matter if the bulb's on its side or whatever way it up. What is important is that you do allow a little bit of space so the plants can push through each other. So your density needs to be rationalised quite well. So you'll allow a bit of space. Otherwise, you just get a massive root, and any plants you're trying to grow at the top will probably struggle a little bit. But
eventually, if you've got crocuses through to tulips, you're going to have are we thinking sort of January, February through to April, May, really,
yeah,
isn't it? So that's a really long period. And then once they're finished, obviously the summer bedding will be out in the garden centres by that point, so you can then replace it all and have all year round cover.
What I do with my couple of lasagne pots, which I do, I once they've done their thing, I then remove them. I put them in a quiet area of the garden so that they can naturally die down.
Yep.
I feed that container, and I usually get at least 2 seasons of flower from those bulbs. I probably wouldn't push a third year, but then obviously would then dismantle and put the bulbs into the garden. So everything is upcycled. You're not wasting anything, which is good as well in the garden these days.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you can start some nice new displays then with a new range of plants, and be inspired by the likes of tailors to put some nice new varieties in.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Chris. I've really enjoyed learning about this lasagna idea, and I think I might give it a go this year.
Please do.
And our next show in a couple of weeks' time is what to do in October.
Yes, plenty to look forward to.
Nearly into winter.
Not quite, though. No, please not. Yeah, the clocks have got to change before then.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Peter. Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.